I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Professor Aaron Tesfaye, who's a professor in the Department of Political Science. He was a Fulbright Fellow in the 1994 at the Institute of Ethiopian Studies. He's the author of a book called Political Power and Ethnic Federalism, The Struggle for Democracy in Ethiopia. He has written about Darfur for ZNet, one of whose editors is sitting here. And he's working on a new book called The Political Economy of the Nile Waters Regime. Aaron, thank you very much.
Thank you. We're gathered here today to remember the people of Darfur. And Darfur, of course, as my colleagues, Dr. Ali Dinar and Dr. Amir Idris will share with us tonight, predates the modern state of Sudan, and it's an ancient African kingdom comparable to Mali and other African empires, Ethiopia and Zimbabwe and so forth. It's very old. Really, the story of Darfur is complicated. So is the story of Africa. I won't belabor a whole point here, but suffice to say, really, Africa was basically destroyed by colonialism, and in 2 or 3 centuries, we Africans are supposed to put it back together. Okay, and so this is a conundrum. 3 things I would like to mention about Africa. If you forget everything, 3 things that we should all remember is there are deep structural problems in Africa that need to be addressed before we could even address issue of refugees and other matters, even though that is very important. One is the debt overhang in Africa. The debt is killing African nations. Something like $100 billion leaves the continent into the coffers of international banks. This is an illegitimate debt that was pushed onto African nations by Western institutions. It should be cancelled. Africa does not owe this money to international banks. It's odious debt. If Saudi Arabia could forgive the debt of Iraq, if the United States could say the debt that was owed by Cuba during the Spanish-American War was illegitimate, is odious, we say African debt is illegitimate and odious, it should be cancelled. The second thing that needs to be addressed about Africa is the AIDS pandemic. The AIDS pandemic is killing Africans between the ages of 18 and 45. Increasingly, what is left in Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, are old people and young people. This will have tremendous consequences in terms of economy, in terms of security for African nations, and so forth. And the third thing that is very important for Africa is leveling the terms of trade. Africa, increasingly in the global economy, has been relegated to a plantation economy. This must be reversed, and the current international trade regime, finance regime, WTO and others really have to work to reverse this. African leaders are trying to do this. African intellectuals write about this. But Africa cannot do it by itself without solidarity with progressives, people of goodwill, of colors, all colors, in the United States, in Latin America, in Asia, and so forth and so on. And now I'll return to the program here after plugging my thing for Africa. Okay. We have 3 panelists here tonight. His Excellency Dawit Yohannes, Ethiopian ambassador to the United Nations. He couldn't come today because he is ill, and we wish him well. Hope he gets better soon. Our other 2 participants are Dr. Ali Dinar, who is also the great-grandson of the Sultan of Darfur. Dr. Ali Dinar is an outreach director, African Studies Program, University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Dinar was born and raised in Sudan and educated in Sudan and the US. He received the PhD in African Folklore and Folklife, University of Pennsylvania in 1995. Dr. Dinar's teaching and research focuses on the reordering of state-society relations. History and Identity Politics in Sudan, and Information Technology and Challenges of Online Research in Africa. Dr. Dinar is author of numerous articles on Sudan and Africa. He has given talks and been interviewed by numerous media, ranging from Correio Brasiliense to Voice of America, BBC to KPFA, and has made numerous presentations at academic conferences and colleges throughout the United States and abroad. Dr. Dinar is, as I mentioned, the great grandson of the former Sultan of Darfur. Our second panelist is Dr. Amir Idris, Assistant Professor of African Studies at Fordham University. Dr. Idris was born and raised in Sudan, educated in Sudan and Egypt, Canada and the USA. He received his PhD in African history from Queen's University, Canada in 2000. Dr. Idris's teaching and research focuses on the history and politics of colonialism, slavery and race, and post-colonial citizenship in Northeast and Central Africa. He has published a book, Sudan's Civil War, Slavery, Race, and Formational Identities, Edwin Mellon Press, and recently has published another book, Conflict and Politics of Identity in the Sudan. He has also published several chapters, in book chapters, and is currently working on a manuscript entitled Challenges of a Democratic Citizenship in Sudan, Blood is Thicker Than Religion. Dr. Dinar and Dr. Amir Idris, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the president of the university, and thanks to Aaron and Dr. Stan. And thanks to all the students here and people from the community who prefer to come and listen to what we are going to say about Darfur, and also for watching that very moving film. And when I came here, I just like say maybe this is an audience which I will educate, but I'm wrong. Because I cried from the door, there are a lot of things for people to sign. So there's a lot of activism in this campus with regard to this issue. And I just salute you all for being active in this. And I also salute and greet all those people who lost loved ones in different conflicts over the history by state-sponsored killing, whether in the Holocaust or whether in other sponsored killing by the state against the citizen. What is my role here? I think like the 60 minutes just like change the whole order, because I thought like of my plan is just to push you and to lift you of understanding to the conflict, and we'll end up by the 60 minutes. So I'm just going back and giving you ABCs, and again it's the backdrop of you seeing all these things. So I think like our role here is just not to make things simple, but to make it very complicated and very complex. And we will be very happy when you leave this room to ask more questions and to think more than just enjoying the presentation and enjoying the film. Because if that is what you will end up, I mean, we never get into your head. So we want to get into your head by challenging you, and by challenging you just by letting you to ask a lot of questions. And that is one way of knowing this conflict, you see. Because if you rely on the media portrayal about the conflict, I think like that's in the beginning and it's done. That is just to draw your attention to think about this conflict. And everyone now is drawn And I think from now on, your responsibility is to get more education about the conflict. And one thing, one just simple thing, and which is ends by the film, is that you have just, in order to know the Darfur conflict, you have to know more about the government of Sudan, the state in Sudan, and why it's just like using war, not against the Ethiopians, not against the Egyptians, not against the Chadians, not against the Congolese or the Ugandan, but against a citizen. Why a state kill a citizen? And I think like you have just to keep asking yourself this question, because it makes no sense, just like the killing in Virginia makes no sense, but like that is also maybe for more questions to ask why. And one thing is that like we are not gonna cover it here, but like just to take it with you in thinking about it, it's just like you have just to think about this conflict in context to the Sudan government, in context regionally to Africa and to neighboring countries with direct relation to the Sudan, and also to think about it globally. Because this issue, even the story about Jacob, I mean, you could just think about it in a very different way. And one thing, simple thing is that like when you look here at this map, you have just not to look at the map about the Sudan, but just look Sudan and its neighbors. And to what extent, like just a state like this with all these borders, and as you have just seen in the movie, the borders are very flimsy. You could just walk and you would be in another country. You have relatives here, relatives there, you see. So this is a situation. Movement. This boundary is just very arbitrary. You could just walk and cross. People coming, people from all different places move across time. One big thing you have just to think about it, specifically in Sudan, about Arabia, about the Red Sea down there. And just think over the years, people migrated, people of Arab descent or Arabs, just like from the 7th century onward, they just migrated to Egypt, to North America, all the way to Spain. Some of these groups also, they penetrated into Sudan. And so that is why in the media, when we think about Arabs, African, you have just to think about this process of Arabization. You have just to think about this process of Islamization, you see. Another thing also you have just to think about it, to think about in terms of ecology, in terms of environment, you have just to think, this is Sudan, you know that south of Egypt, you know the Nile, and you know the Sahara, and that is the Sahara, the desert, and then whenever you move south, maybe more savanna, more trees to semi-equatorial. To an extent that will just affect also the diversity and change and different kinds of cultures, different kinds of ethnic populations living across, different lives of economic activities, all kinds across. Different religions, you see. Arabs, Islam, long time ago, Sudan and Egypt won. More pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt. That is a fact, you have to know that. Sudan at some point ruled Egypt. Hieroglyph, Meroitic languages, that is in Sudan. Sudan also at some point there are 3 Christian kingdoms, not in the south, not in Darfur, but in the north, which is now Islamic. 3 Christian kingdoms, and then after that, like all these Muslim states, you have just to think about all this. Then Sudan was ruled by Turkey, and then Sudan ruled jointly by British and Egypt until it gets independence in 1956. So when you think about all this accumulation, just to think about it in terms of identity of people, in terms of political situation in Darfur, in Sudan, and so on. When we think about Darfur here, okay, you have just to think about it as my predecessor spoke, is that they have to think about it in terms also of during the 17th and 18th century in terms of West African states, you see. So Darfur Kingdom, and then you have Wadad, which is now part of Chad, and then you will find the Songhai or so on. So there is more relation also to West African states and also Darfur as an independent entity. What about the Darfur history? Just in a nutshell, this is it. I mean, if you know this, you will be an expert on Darfur history, and you could just brag about that. So these three ethnic groups, the Dado, this is an ethnic group, you see, but it established a state during this period. And then followed by the Tunyur, this is also an ethnic group. And then the Fur, who only found in Darfur, in Sudan. But the Tunyur, you'll find them in Sudan and in Chad. The Dado also, they live in Sudan and Chad. And then there is this brief time in which Darfur was being occupied, and it regained independence in 1916. And then, 1916, and some parts of Darfur gets independence only in 1921. So when you think about it, just think about it in relation to the central government. And that Darfur itself, in the psyche of government and people coming from other places in Sudan, specifically in the north or so on, is not that very deep. And that is something historical. One thing which we just talk about is about the ethnic composition in the region, because people like all this kind of reference to the Arabs and Africans or so on. To an extent that is true or not true. When you look here, this is just a brief map. Because like in the media, you just always think about these three African tribes, which they just call them. The Fur, the Dagawa, and the Masali. Yes, these are, but there are a lot of other non-Arab tribes living, and they have names, you see. As well as when they call Arab groups, they have names. Because you will not go there in Darfur and you will find, this is an Arab. Because like there's a lot of variation and a lot of names, you see. So you will find, like, say, Beni Hanba, this is an Arab group. You'll find down south there, Bagara, that is an Arab group. You'll find Rizidat, that is an Arab group. You'll find Dagaw in the north, that is an African. You'll find Masalid, that is. All these groups are Muslims. What's the difference between the Africans and what you call them Arabs here? Is that like the Arab groups, Arabic is their main tongue, of course, they are all Muslims. Non-Arab groups, they have their languages, but Arabic is the lingua franca, you see. In terms of economic activity, a lot of Arab groups, they are owners of camel or cattle. And a lot of African groups, they are farmers, but also there are some nomads, just like the Zabawa, they own camels and it's part of their sign of wealth, you see. Is there intermarriages between these groups? Yes. I mean, whenever you live in this place, there are a lot of intermarriage and people live close together, you see. And how is the identity issue in this group? Is it that rigid? No, it is very fluid. You could just be an Arab, depending on, in some places, depending on your kind of economic activity. If you lost it, if you settle down, you could just be a Fur, you see. So it is very fluid. It's not that very rigid. Okay, what makes about all these ethnic groups? What is the main important criteria? The main important criteria is the ownership of a land. Because all these groups, their homeland is called Dar, which is an Arab word, Zagawa. This is the land of the Zagawa. It has a boundary. This is the land which the Zagawa lives. This is the land, if you are a Zagawa, you could just run to an office. If you are non-Zagawa, you could just live there, but you could not assume power from a place which is not yours. Just like here, you have to establish residency. And likewise, Dar Rizegat or Dar Ta'aisha, that is Arab groups, you see. So all these groups, whether they are Africans, whether they are Arabs, they are just indigenous to the land, you see. And they have ownership and they have the right to live there like anyone else. So don't think about, when you read in the media about Arab groups of Darfur as newcomers. These were there for a long time. And they have documents from successive Darfurian sultans giving them these lands from this place to this place. So this is the kind of thing which I think like you need to think about it. About the conflict which brought us here, because like when you go and read on the news or so on, they all talk about the conflict starting from 2003. And that is for sometimes people coming and saying, okay, one thing, let us go to the core of the conflict. What is this conflict is about? you see? And you have just to make that kind of demarcation. Is that like in Darfur, there are conflicts. These conflicts, there are some kind of conflicts which predate the conflict that why you were here, that is from pre-2003. And then there are another reasons of a conflict that is after 2003. Is Darfur like a serene place before 2003 and everyone is very happy and hugging each other and there is no problems? Of course not. There are a lot of trouble, you see, a lot of problems, you see. There are ecological factors, just think about that. Because of the drought, because of the desertification, what it will do is that it will just push people. It will push people from places which to places which are not theirs. That is always could be recipe of conflict. You see? And conflict could be like conflict over grazing land, conflict in a water source. It could just rise and people will just take arms, you see? What is the most important thing about this conflict pre-2003? Is that these conflicts will start and consume in one geographical locale. It will not spread to other places. So if it starts a conflict in place A, it will end up in place A. People from other places, they will not come to A here. They're pregnant. That is one characteristic which you will not see in the next cycle of. Another thing also you have to think about it, competition over resources. You have to think about the government involvement in dissolving like the traditional system of governance. You have just to think also about the role of Libya and Chad, role of Libya and the government of Sudan in deciding who rules Chad and funneling of arms to Chad. And then these arms and armed groups finding their way back to Darfur. So conflicts which could just be resolved maybe peacefully, now there is a new weapon, you see? And the place is just very underdeveloped. These are some just very few reasons about this conflict. What is the result of this conflict? There is widespread of ethnic conflicts. Ethnic conflicts, conflicts between groups, you see? Banditry, migration, and all these things, and then like this sense of racial tension between groups, Arabs versus non-Arabs. It just surfaced in that time. This is just like to give you an idea about conflicts in Darfur between different ethnic groups over history, you see? And then you could just tell like the frequencies of it and between whom, you see? And I think this will just dispel this myth about Africans-Arab conflicts as it is today as the reason behind this issue here. And then it goes all the way to 2007. Even now, like this, the last two, like the Tergum and the Rizega, these are all Arab groups. People accuse them even like being Janjaweed themselves. So Janjaweed themselves fighting. And there is someone who is benefiting from this, who is the Sudanese government from this. What is the situation after 2003? As in the news here, there is this political insurgency. And one way of the government of Sudan is just trying to quell that insurgency is adopting this policy of attacking civilians. And attacking civilians in Darfur is not like a new policy. It was waged long time ago in another conflict in Sudan, which just came to an end in 2005 between the north and the south, in which they also, the government created ethnically based militias. In the south, the ethnically based militias are not merely Arabs, but also people from southern Sudan, people who were Africans. But like still these militias, they are there with the side of the government of Sudan, you see? So that like you have just to think about when you read in the news, the Arab content of the regime, the Islamic content of the regime, I think you have to put under line about it, is that the regime in Sudan, the government in Sudan, at some point, it just used these things, you see? It's not like deep in heart to them. It could just sacrifice them, it is just opportunist, and it could just use what is suitable for it. And therefore, it used mainly the Arab militias, because it is suitable. But it could just be African militias. There is no, the government of Sudan is not going there and just selecting, the Arabs come and then I will give you arms and do it. It is opportunist. It just used the same tactic. And the same tactic is that you create ethnically based militias from groups who are very vulnerable in terms of wealth, maybe, like those in the Janjaweed here, from groups who have like traditional animosity with the main rebel groups. You see? Like in the south, because the main rebel groups say the Dinka have traditional animosities with other groups, so the government of Sudan just created these militias. The same thing also here. These Janjaweed, like a lot of them, they are neighbors. They are living in this, you see. Although some of these Janjaweed also they being imported from Niger, from Mali, from Central Africa, and so on, and they came just to aid that. But the core of them, they are Darfurians, you see. And one thing also here which is new is that the use of helicopters, which was never used in the past, and that is one of the new aspects of the war, because in the past war, 2003, I mean, you never use, the government is not like using planes and helicopters in killing people. Okay, the result is just like clear. I think like that thing is, the film is very clear. One thing I think like which you just need to think about it is that like why a government at some point like just use war, and I think that is a legitimate question you have just to ask. And I think in the case of Sudan, the continuation of atrocities against civilians, it is good for the government of Sudan, and these are just like some of the reasons which I just think, and you could just consider them. Think about adding more or deleting some. You see. In a war like this. Because in some situation, war is giving the government of Sudan more leverage. Up to this very second, Jan Lograbanti in Sudan, Jendai Fraser in Sudan, just like this, and then like top official from Ministry of Defense in Sudan. This is just like now, you see. Just think about to what extent war and the continuation of this war in Sudan, it gives the Sudan government a window of maneuvering and of engagement, continuous engagement at not just locally, but regionally and international level, you see. That is one thing, to achieve its goals, you see. And to achieve its goals, maybe for the government of Sudan, sometimes maybe you think it's simple, but for it, it's more. This is what it's just striving to do. Having better relationship with the U.S. That is what people say. Having good relationship, restoring relationship with Sudan. That is what the government of Sudan. And in order to do that, it just go far. You see, it will go far. It will not desist from attacking unless it just feels that there is very serious and imminent threat. And this imminent threat just came today. And that is one thing which you could just think about it. One thing also you have just to think about, there is a peace agreement in the conflict in Darfur, and then there is a peace agreement also ended the war in the south. In the south of Sudan, when you go and look there, the situation is very dismal. People just don't know what will happen because there was supposed to be an election, supposed to be a referendum. The militias of the militias, again, is the ethnically based militias in the south. They are still there. They are unarmed. And then here, when you look in the Darfur region also, the peace agreement was just signed by just one faction of it, you see. And here, I think like this is, it comes the maneuver. It's that like the art of survival. War with a peace agreement, and you have a peace situation in which it's not 100% peace, but you have an agreement. So if some people pushing you on the south, you will come with Darfur. If they push you in Darfur, you will just come with the south. and you will just get the whole international community is confused. And I think like the whole international community is confused and being played very awfully by the government of Sudan. I don't want to talk about the response of the international community, but this is like just one thing, just to give you an idea about where are we, where is the UN. These are all these past resolutions. The only one which is just being adopted about referring the killers to the International Criminal Court, you see, and up to now, just 2 people were just being indicted and still not yet like being sent to court. So we will see. This is like part of U.S. Response also, but with all this kind of activity, with all this kind of UN or U.S., with all the kind of visits to Darfur, the situation there is not changing up to this second, you see. Up to this second, it's not changing. And I think that is, we have just to ask ourselves why it is not changing. And why it is not changing is that like you have to know all the complexities. And one of these complexities, like you shown in the film here, about the relation, for example, of the US with the government of Sudan in fighting terrorism, the position of the African Union in the conflict, which its troop is there, but it is just milking, it's not providing any security. The role of the European community in that, the role of Arab countries and Islamic countries, which is always aligned with the government of Sudan. And I think like within all these complexities, one thing which definitely it makes a lot of sense is that like you have to keep the pressure on. And only by keeping the pressure on, and I think like by linking this conflict, like not just as a hobby, just because you are here, just let's go, and then because you are in a college or something, but link it to higher moral values of you siding with victims, and what's your role, whether there is a change or no, because there's a lot of conflict in the world, and people will never get nothing, you see. There are refugees all over, and the people of Darfur also, this is my country, this is my people, I go and visit, but also deep in my heart, I'm not like optimistic that a lot of people, they will just, that's it, that is the end of their life. These people who are killed, these people who are being refugees, these people who are being displaced, this is the end. But in even realizing this would be, what is my responsibility as a citizen? Do I just say, okay, I have nothing, Bush is doing nothing, African Union doing nothing, UN is doing nothing? I don't think that is the answer. And I think like you have just to keep on doing things which makes you happy, a relief that you contribute to making a change. And this change could just come during our lifetime, or it may not come. But I hope it will come. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dinar. I'm sure we have a lot of questions for you. And now Dr. Amir Idris, who will address the issue of state-society relations in Sudan and U.S. foreign policy. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank those who invited me to come to this university. This is the second time, so I came here 3 years ago, I guess, and I met some of you. And sadly, I have to come back because the problem, I guess, we failed to address it. And at that time, when I came in 2004, I mentioned in one of my speeches that we lost more than 50,000 people. And today we're talking about 400,000 people. So I guess you can see the difference. Thanks to my colleagues who somehow he saved me from talking about some of the details of my talks. But I would like to share with you some of my reflection on this. First of all, I strongly believe that there is a tendency in this part of the world to perceive the crisis in Darfur in isolation from the regional conflicts that have been manifesting in the country for the half century. These conflicts, in my view, including the conflict in Darfur, but also the conflicts in eastern part of Sudan, the northern part of the Sudan as well, and I mean by the northern parts is the northern part geographically, also the southern parts of the country. These conflicts, in my view, reflects a serious crisis of national identity that is both a cause of genocidal wars and a factor in the resulting humanitarian consequences. The conflicts in Sudan indicate, in my view, a nation that is painfully searching for itself, is striving to be free from historical discrimination based on race, ethnicity, religion, and culture. It is therefore necessary to all of us to combine a sensible humanitarian response with political solutions that address the root causes of the conflict. And for that reason, I decided to limit my comments on answering three important questions on this point. First, what were the underlying causes of the crisis? To what extent have the root causes were addressed by the peace agreements? And I mean by the peace agreements, the comprehensive peace agreement that's signed between the government of the Sudan and the Sudan People Liberation Army movements in 2005, and also the Darfur peace agreement that's signed in May 2005. What are the prospects for a truly comprehensive and lasting peace and for a successful process of nation building in the Sudan? The first question, what were the underlying causes of the conflicts? In my view, I believe while some of us tend to suggest that the root causes of the conflicts lie in the ethnic and tribal structure of the Sudanese society, others have highlighted the roles of the colonial state on inventing and legalizing ethnic and racial identities. Much emphasis has been laid either on the colonial, on the post-colonial period, but very little on the pre-colonial context. This tendency has led many to, I guess, associate peace with ending the wars and building democratic institutions. But the political history of the Sudan has shown that ending the wars and adopting democracy does not necessarily lead to lasting peace. How? The crisis in Darfur is a major challenge to many academics, policymakers, and politicians to move away from the narrow race, ethnic-based politics that they have embraced for so many decades. The crisis of Darfur has also revealed the failure of the North-South paradigm in explaining the root causes of the conflicts. In the context of the North-South conflicts in the Sudan, the people of Darfur are commonly considered Muslim, Arabs, and Northerners. Yet, like the people of Southern Sudan, they have been oppressed, deprived, and the least developed economically. But the question that they would like to pose is, what do we mean by African and Arabs in the context of the Sudan? Are they racial, cultural, or political identities? The answer to these questions would determine the nature and the meanings of the conflicts and thus the effective approach to peace. I suggest that we should move away from the simplistic understanding of the Sudan conflicts that often cast the conflict in terms of South versus North or African against Arabs. Alternatively, I suggest that the Sudan conflicts have highlighted the demand for equal citizenship and social justice as main causes of the crisis. This new perspective shifts the discussion on Sudan conflict from race and ethnicity to issues of nationality and citizenship. The legacy of the past has certainly had tremendous impacts on the persisting current violent conflicts between the nation state and the subordinated groups in the country. We do need, in my view, to define and restructure the framework of national identity. But to do so, Sudanese should reject the existence of a single vision of national identity, which historically meant being associated with the Arab Islamic heritage. I would argue that also the legacy of slavery and colonialism have contributed to the creation of two categories of people with different entitlement. Those who are considered Arabs by the state are treated as citizens, and those who are perceived as non-Arabs are treated as subjects. Therefore, in my view, people of Darfur are dying today simply because they are non-Arabs. If we accept this line of argument, then neither of the two wars in the south nor the current conflict in Darfur are aberration. Instead, these wars should be viewed as a product of a state dominated from its inception by the interests of an Islamized and Arabized groups. The form of the states that was created during the pre-colonial period and consolidated and also institutionalized its policies during the colonial and the post-colonial period laid the seeds of the current political violence. The process of state formation in the Sudan was and is a violent process. Discrimination, displacement, slavery, genocide were all strategies used by the state to quell opposition groups. Indeed, since Sudan gained its political independence in 1956, many opportunities were missed to negotiate a peaceful solution, which could have prevented the escalation of political violence. One of the factors that had contributed to this crisis was the lack of political commitment to extend the privilege of citizenship to marginalized groups, something that would have created new norms and principles of governance. Of course, the hegemonic dominance of the Khartoum elites over the southern, eastern, western regions contributed to the spread of political violence. The existing political and ideological structures of the state contribute to failure of the Khartoum elite to extend the privilege of citizenship to those who live in the southern Sudan and also those who live in western Sudan, including people of Darfur. So, therefore, neither culture nor race is at the center of the current conflict. Rather, in my view, it is the racialized states that transform cultural identities into political identities through the practice of slavery in the pre-colonial period, in direct rules during the colonial period, and state-exclusive policy of citizenships in the post-colonial period. So, the second question, to what extent have the root causes were addressed by the peace agreement? So, both the Comprehensive Peace Agreement and the Darfur Peace Agreements have not effectively addressed the national crisis of citizenships and the marginalization of the non-Arab groups. It is also becoming obvious that the implementation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement and the Darfur Peace Agreement are seriously defective. So the question is then, what do we supposed to do? And what is the role of the international community? I'm going to skip part of my remark, because I have 7 minutes. What are the prospects for the future then? The widespread disappointments with the way the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, is being implemented, and the low expectations surrounding the fate of the Darfur Peace Agreement make the situation in Sudan very, very fragile and very volatile as well. The international community, as all of us we know, is deeply divided, perhaps paralyzed, over what to do next in Darfur. The situation on the ground shows a number of negative trends, which have been developing since 2004. Mounting civilian casualties, a credible threat of famine, ceasefire in shambles, rebel movements are beginning to splinter, and new armed movements appearing in Darfur and neighboring states such as Chad and Central Africa. A culture of immunity is taking roots in the region. Discovering the oil has since brought Africa's largest nation wealth and power. China is a large consumer and developing partner. The United States has complex relationships with the Sudan as it tries to obtain information about Al-Qaeda from Sudanese intelligence officials. Osama bin Laden was expelled from the country before moving to Afghanistan. Two of the world's biggest economic and political power are thus cautious to take direct action against the regimes that massacres its own people. The Sudan government powerful allies, in my view, United States and China, have not done enough to curb it is abuses. The African Unions declared the situation an African problem to be solved by Africa, and I do not subscribe to that view simply because I believe the African Union has neither the political will nor the military capacity to provide credible protection. And the international community did not measure up to the needs of the African Union for support with the financial equipment and logistics. The effort of the African Union, which has already committed 7,000 troops to the western region of Darfur, are not enough. The United Nations Resolution 1706, calling for ground troops to be deployed, must be enforced with or without the Khartoum consent. Resolution, in my view, are just words on paper until troops are on the ground. We have to start looking at the Sudan government as part of the problems, not part of the solutions. Sudanese president has repeatedly rejected the United Nations force for Darfur, where more than 400,000 people have been killed and 2.5 million have been displaced since the conflicts began in 2003. On Monday, just 2 days ago, April 16, after 5 months of shuttle diplomacy and deliberations, Sudanese government approved the deployments of 3,000 UN personnel, mostly military and police staff, and 6 attack helicopters in Darfur. The United Nations peacekeepers are to provide logistic communications, intelligence, and air support to 7,000 under-equipped African Union troops that have failed to stop 4 years of bloody genocide in Darfur. The 3,000 peacekeepers are part of the so-called heavy support package, which is the second phase of the United Nations plan to help a 7,000 strong African Union force in Darfur. The ultimate goal of the United Nations is the deployment of 20,000 strong hybrid African Unions and UN force, a move Sudan opposed, and the president of Sudan rejected. But given the Sudan history of backtracking on such an agreement, United States and UK diplomats and also United Nations officials said on Monday they would be cautious until the United Nations peacekeepers are on the grounds, and I support that position. Therefore, in my view, was an opportunity, and also an opportunity today for the United Nations and the African Union to demonstrate their ability to go beyond the traditional constraint of sovereignty. Instead, sovereignty should be seen as a positive concept of a state responsibility to protect and assist its citizens in cooperation with the international community. Beyond responding to the immediate humanitarian crisis in Darfur today, and all of us will support that, we do need to help these people, and we have to help them now. But I think the international community should make a concerted effort to help the Sudanese people to develop a framework of national identity based on the acceptance of diversity and full equality of citizenship. Just as peace came to the south and will most likely be realized in other regions through the active involvement of regional and international actors, the transformation of the country into a new Sudan of full equality will also need the help of the international community. However, in the end, the future of the Sudan is in the hands of the Sudanese people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for trying to clarify extremely complex situation. Aaron, do you want to join us?
Sure.
We have plenty of time for comments, questions from the audience, and so we welcome any and all questions and comments. Please.
I just want to say that after hearing everything and being educated a little bit more than I originally was, I just want to say that as an immigrant, and as an American now, as a late citizen, I've noticed that in many ways the United States of America has done its best in helping other nations, and in many ways it's done absolutely nothing based on its political agenda. And the United States will always act on its political agenda. And from what I've noticed, if we really wanted to help more, we could. And in that sense, we wouldn't be here getting extra credit or doing whatever that half of these kids are doing when they leave like they did. But the fact of the matter is that our administration, from what I understand, and I know you said, I heard you say, don't blame it all on the administration, but the thing is, we live in a country where this administration does not listen to the UN. And the UN was a step in humanity. That's a great thing. United Nations, like, that's brilliant. But we don't care at all. This administration said, they said, don't go to war. We asked them, which didn't even matter that we asked, but we asked them, should we go to war? They didn't care whatsoever. We went to war. There have been schools of children killed this year in 2007, since January, in Iraq.
Could you state it in the form of a question
Okay,
to the
all I'm
panel?
trying to say is, do you really think that we shouldn't be blaming our administration as a group, as an American society? And do you think it should be our duty to contact our government and try to do more, and to raise more questions within the American people and the American government, as opposed to trying, like, you know.
Okay, that's a good question. Let the panel answer.
All right, I'm sorry, I'm just curious. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Okay.
There's nothing wrong with extra credit, by the way. Sure, you fill the house.
Yeah. No, I think that is a good question, and that is a legitimate question. I think you have responsibility towards the government, as well as the government also has responsibility towards you. And one thing is that, like, the government listens to you. You see, that is different. You are living in a democratic society in which your vote counts, and your vote counts not there in Washington, but even here in your own university, your vote counts. You see, and I think the important thing is that, like, you have to be real. You see, you have to be real and to know your limitation. You have a voice. Your voice could topple down your state representative or city, or maybe even the president or something, and maybe that is why they will never dismiss you. Like, even today, like, whatever. Like, first of all, you have to give yourself a credit. You have to give the United States a credit. You see, when you look at the donors, you see, people who and government which contribute money to the disaster in Sudan, U.S. is on top. I mean, I mean, people there, they just don't know these complexities. People were very happy with Bush. People were very happy with the U.S. People want the U.S. to come and save them, you see, because of what they see. And when you will go to any camp in Darfur, these plastic sheets and the food ration or so on, U.S. aid is there. It's, you can deny that, you see. But still, just like you and me and others, we demand more from the administration. We demand more from the administration, not only because it is our representative, but because of the leverage it has. Because the U.S. has a big hand, you see, and still I believe if the U.S. like made this of something of its national interest, it will get it right away, and not China, you see, and not Russia. Because Russia and China, when the U.S. make Iran its top agenda, they never vetoed. They just came along with the U.S., you see. And I think the U.S. has that leverage, and still it has that leverage. And it's not like something which, but also I'm just realist, and you have just to be realist. U.S. troops will never go to Sudan, to Darfur. That's it. I mean, that is, I mean, everyone knows, and I'm not like, I'm counting on that. But, and even there, even for me, for example, as Sudanese, also, I don't want U.S. troops there, you see, because it is bad for the country. It is bad for the Sudanese. This is something Sudanese, and the Sudanese, they have to solve it themselves. But still, they need the backing. Because why we were just going about the UN? Because with the UN, no one will say, this is a unilateral, this is just like the US or the EU or this government. This is the whole international community issue. And I think like the issue of Darfur, it is not like something of concern just to the US. This is a global issue, you see? And if it's a global issue, it has to be addressed globally. And so, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, in the back. you stand up, please?
When I hear you talk about the situation, the first thing that comes to my mind is invasion. And I know that you just said that it's the people's position to take care of the country. But when you have leaders of the country that are killing the people, why continue to create peace agreements that won't be really enforced? Why ask them to bring in troops? Why not just push them in? Or, you know, I know there has to be some type of infrastructure when you talk about change in administration, but who was there before he came into power? You know, are there bloodlines in terms of, you know, power, the power structure? Like, is there a time when you force instead of trying to be amicable in a situation like this?
Very good question. You can talk. Do you want to use that phone?
Okay, that's a good question. It's a good question. Let me just say something. First of all, if we want to address the crisis in Darfur, we need to understand that the crisis is not really a regional crisis, it's a national problem. That's one. Secondly, if we want to deal with the current situation in Darfur, the Darfur crisis has three components. The humanitarian aspect of it, the security aspect of it, and then the political aspect. The humanitarian aspect of it, we need to address the immediate needs of people who live in the refugees camps. Okay? But that cannot be done unless we allow the international relief organizations to go and have access to these people. So we know the Sudan government is putting a lot of constraints, preventing and banning so many relief agencies from having access to these people. But this third step, you cannot reach that stage unless you deal with the two important elements, the humanitarian problems that we need to do now and deal with this now. It's not tomorrow, now. And then the security issue, protect the people. And the third issue then, after people feel that they're secure, they have access to food, then you can ask people to sit at the table and figure out a political solution. And that cannot be done unless you have some kind of international intervention.
Yeah, but I think like what I said, and I just repeat to my friend here, is that I'm not with the U.S. intervention. I'm with the UN. That is what I mean.
Thank you.
Peter, I want to add something. In fact, I was going to present my talk, but in view of the time and the discussions, I'm going to leave it. The whole issue about the responsibility to protect civilians in Africa is a loaded question. In fact, today, there is an emerging international norm that is before the United Nations. I think the draft of it was more or less approved by the United Nations Assembly, and that is called the responsibility to protect civilians in nations, in countries where the state is deliberately committing genocide or killing its citizens. What is the responsibility of the international community? When the state itself becomes a criminal state, and it's annihilating, imprisoning, killing its own citizens, where does the international community stand? Well, just recently, Canada and some other countries, including the United States, came up with this legal international norm called the responsibility to protect civilians in any nation, basically, which is violating fundamental rights. Okay. Now, certain nations have said no to this emerging norm because they're afraid that this norm could be used by bigger nations to simply bully other smaller nations. Such nations that are against this adamantly are Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and maybe India and two other nations also, because they're afraid this would be legitimizing imperialism. Okay, now that is a serious concern. But on the other hand, What do we do when a state basically starts killing its own citizens? Do we stand by, we stand and say, well, that is, a state is sovereign, it can do whatever it wants to, it within its territory. To intervene is to intervene in a state is to violate international law, because states are supposed to be sovereign in their own territory. So that is the conundrum. Okay, when to intervene? Clearly, in the case of Africa, Africans do not really want Europeans to intervene because of the historical legacies. The British just intervened in Sierra Leone, okay, because of the civil war and stuff, and they managed to shape things out and move out because Sierra Leone was very small. Okay, I think it would be hugely a mistake if the United States, sent troops into the Sudan. Sudan is huge. Okay, it's undoable. Sudan is also Islamic. Okay, besides, the United States is bogged down in Iraq anyways. Okay, so we're not, the question is not, Europe or NATO or any other European state or a national state to intervene. I think the question is, how do we get the United Nations to intervene? How do we get to isolate the Khartoum regime? Okay, because, as Dr. Dinar mentioned, the United States has tremendous muscle, politically, economically, militarily. It can do what it wants to. Well, to a certain degree, because right now it's being checked by China and Russia, the Security Council, and so forth.
These are wonderful conversations. I wish we had a month. Jane?
I have two questions. My first one is kind of a little history. I heard someone say that all of the Arab nations, and if I heard this correctly, all of the Arab nations support this solidarity in supporting the government of the Sudan. I'm wondering if that's always been the case, or if there has been a time in our recent history where maybe there were some Arab nations that didn't completely go in solidarity with the Arab nations supporting the regime in the Sudan, and what may have changed that. And my other question is, if the UN were to declare the situation in Darfur a genocide, would the Genocide Convention compel the UN towards certain different actions?
I will take the first one and let my colleague take the second. About the response of the Arab nations with regard to the conflict in Darfur, I think they are all coming to the rescue of the Sudan government. I mean, that is obvious, not only in public statement and official statements, but also with regard to the Arab League, in which the Sudan is, I think last year Sudan was the president. Last year Sudan want to be in 2006, Sudan want to be spent a lot of money. It want to be the president of the African Union, and it was vetoed down. That was, I think, that was 2006,
right,
yeah?
Right.
And given to the Congolese president, you see. And then again, this year also, it tried to lobby, because they said, fix the issue in Darfur, and next time it will be yours, and Darfur never been fixed. So even this year, it was given to the Ghanaian president. So for the African states, I mean, the situation is clear, you see. They send troops. There is a lot of sympathy with regard to the conflict, the way it's now being run and done by the Sudan government. With regard to the Arab League, I mean, they are all in support. They are all in support because they have their own agendas, and they have all their agendas because this is the people who were thinking about the conspiracy and trying to link the conflict of Darfur. And why this media involvement in Darfur, and why all this? Why not about Palestine? Why not about Iraq? Why Darfur? You see. And as if Darfur is not true, as if all these pictures which you have just seen is just being created. These guys, they just went and fabricated, you see. And that is, for people from there, it's extremely insulting. But that is maybe one of the reasons, because because Darfur is uneasy. They could not say to the US, get out from Iraq or so on, because they know the US is there involved and it could just beat them. Don't do that. Or they could not like accept the Iraqi government as illegitimate, because they knew the US will not accept that, you see. But Darfur is easy. And therefore it's easy to show your muscles, you see, that you could say to the US international community, no, you see. They use that so the for their own agendas, the Arab leagues and the Organization of Islamic Conference, you see. And because of their involvement, and because also the international community also succumbed to this argument and of its inaction, you see, it just widened and giving them more role, like whatever thing like has to do with Darfur. Here in New York, African Union, Arab League is observers, you see. So this is their position. It's very dismal, and that's like just contrary to the position of Sudanese, like in general, with regard to the conflict of the region. Because when we grew up on the Palestinian issue, this is all our education, this thing. But like whenever it comes to Sudan, not only in Darfur, but I mean, you don't find like that kind of a mass support of a Sudanese issue. And now when this media involvement and this international movement with regard to the conflict, they are bringing this conspiracy theories, and I don't subscribe to.
Thank you. I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to ask. You have your hand up and you're next.
In today's New York Times, it was reported that the Sudanese government, in direct defiance of UN mandates, has been transporting arms and munitions into the Darfur region of Sudan, using planes painted white to resemble UN planes. I'd just like to get the panelists' reaction to this finding, whether it should be considered a material breach under international law, and how the situation should be handled.
I guess it's very clear to me the Sudan government has been using this kind of strategies for so long. And so many people send reports to the State Department, to the UN, advising them about these kind of practices. And I have one of my friends work on these kind of issues. But so many people decided not to take them seriously. And I heard that when President Bush today, he mentioned that in his speech. And it seems to me finally they're getting the clear idea of what's taking place in that force. But also one of the things that we can learn from these kind of practices, the Sudan government is clear and they stand only one language. The language, as I guess Tony Blair said last night, is the pressure. So you have to pressure the Sudan governments, and also you have to use all possible means to force the leadership to accept and recognize the magnitude of the violence that is taking place now in Darfur. And also, look, if you are accepting to be part of the international community and want to behave and act according to the international law, then there is some kind of responsibility you have to follow. And one of these responsibilities is to protect your own citizen, and secondly, you have to respect the international law. So I cannot really imagine, after 4 years now, I've been talking about these issues, all the practice and the behavior of the Sudan government demonstrates to us clearly that they violated international law. They claim their own peoples, and we're giving them leverage. Sometimes without some of the report that have been sent by some of the concerned researchers and people who work on these humanitarian issues, and we don't take them seriously. So I guess I'm just glad to hear that the New York Times is talking about it, and also President Bush today, he referred to it in his speech.
And if you want to read it, it's front page of today's New York Times. Thank you. Yes.
I just had a comment and a quick question. First, I think it's wrong to single out the Bush administration with their failures and complicity in this genocide, because historically both Republican and Democratic administrations and controlled Congresses have thumbed their nose at the UN, violated international law, and have propped up either dictators or death squads that have carried out genocidal policies. So I think we have to keep that in mind when critiquing this situation. But regarding my question, one of the themes I've gotten out of this so far is that right now there's not a political will, either by nation states or the UN or international organizations like NATO, to intervene right now. And this has led some people in foreign policy circles like Max Boot to call for what you would maybe describe as the privatization of peacekeeping. Since Afghanistan and Iraq, the mercenary / private security industry has just boomed. It's now a $100 billion a year industry, and it actually contributes the second largest force in the coalition of the willing in Iraq. So I'm wondering, do you see this as something that would actually gain traction within the international community, as kind of outsourcing this peacekeeping mission or private security to private companies? And what do you think would be the human rights implications of that?
Aaron?
Yeah. The conundrum is in this this whole thing about political will. I was asked last October, I was invited to a conference in Accra, Ghana, on this whole issue of the responsibility to protect. And the task I was given was to operationalize political will. How do you garner political will of African leaders to intervene in crisis situations? How do you get politicians to have this political will to say, yeah, what's happening out there is awful, so we're going to go and save some lives? And so really here is the conflict between, national interest. Nations do not act because they're good nations. Nations usually act on something because of the national interest. The United States has always acted on its national interest. I mean, the case of Rwanda, when the Clinton administration basically shut down communications and feigned, no see, no hear, no nothing, when 800 Tutsis were being massacred, the Clinton administration didn't even jam Radio Kigali, where the Interahamwe were broadcasting day in, day out to kill the Tutsis and stuff. Because there was the U.S. had no national interest in Rwanda. Okay, so there is this conflict between national interest and then the value of the citizens of a nation. The value of the citizens of a nation of the United States, for example, you and me, the common people of the United States, is they see Rwanda, they see Kosovo, they see whatever tragedies are occurring, and they wring their hand and say, we wish we could do something. How come our government is not acting despite its political muscle, military muscle, economic muscle? Okay? But the men and women in the State Department are not thinking like you and me. The men and the women in the State Department, okay, the politicians are saying, what is in it for the United States? Okay. There is nothing in it for the United States, according to people in government. There is a lot in Darfur. To us here, there is a lot in Darfur, because the people of Darfur are our sisters and our brothers. There is nothing that separates us from them. Okay, so here is the conflict. Political will translates basically the conflict between national interest and the values of citizens, the values of common people, citizens. We do not value genocide. I'm not saying that the State Department values genocide, but they see it completely differently. I mean, the film showed, there is a collaboration between Washington and Khartoum. The enemy is Al-Qaeda. African people don't figure in this.
Yeah, just like with the question about outsourcing, I don't see that is the direction in which the UN will go to with regard to peacekeeping. But when you look at the peacekeeping force in Darfur of the African Union contingent of 7,000, and when you see the budget, you say this is a force which is just to monitor the ceasefire and to protect the ceasefire monitors, you see, of 7,000. It has no authority, it has no mandate to protect civilians. And when you see the money, this is more than 500 million. The money being spent by the U.S. and the Western governments in a force which is just useless, the African Union. You could just call it subcontracting, or you could just call it outsourcing. This is for their lack of interest to intervene. You see, so that is how I just see it is there, but it is not there. It makes these countries happy that they do something. It's just like the case in Darfur here. You will never see people dying from hunger, because that is a shame. They will always, like just 2 days ago, Oxfam or whatever made this call for 10 millions because people were dying in the border between Sudan and Chad. And of course they will get the millions, you see, because they don't, Western government, they don't tolerate like this image of people dying from hunger, just like the Ethiopians. It will be very bad, you see. So they do that. With regard to the protection, just think about it. And just think about the complicity of the state in not protecting civilians. In the case of Darfur here, it is not like, if the government of Sudan really wants to protect its citizens, if this conflict, as it is said, this is like an ethnic conflict between farmers and nomads and so on, Sudan government is very resourceful. Unfortunately, it has oil, it has huge army, it doesn't like wage war in the south, it manufactures weapons. It could just send these troops to protect the citizens. Doesn't need like UN, doesn't need NATO, doesn't need whatever. It could do that if like just people killing each other. It could police its citizens. But because it is part of the conflict, and because it has interest in the continuation of the conflict, so it just let it go. And just think about it of the engagement. Negroponte and all those people were very happy, but time will just tell.
It's about 9 o'clock. We're going to go till 9:15 to make sure everybody has a chance to ask, and then you can come up and talk to the panelists. But several of you mentioned oil, and we know that China is a major, has great need for oil and energy, and therefore is supporting the government in Sudan. Mia Farrow and other American influential people are trying to put pressure on China. The Olympic Games are in 2008 in Beijing and elsewhere. Can you say something about oil and this whole tragedy and what can or cannot be done?
I think two things we have to remember. One, as you mentioned, China is one of the largest consumers of Sudanese oil now. The Sudan get its revenue from China, by China buying the oil from Sudan. They use that money to buy weapons from Russia. That's why you have the Chinese and the Russian sitting there in the Security Council, threatening the United States and UK by using the veto if they're going to send UN forces to Sudan. So it's, to me, it's very complicated. So because you do have one country that has some kind of strong economic ties with the regimes, China, and they're using their economic relations to prevent the international community from taking any kind of strong action against the government. So regarding what's going to happen in 2008 regarding the Olympics, it seems to me the responsibility of the citizen of the world to do so. So all of us, we are not just a citizen of our respective countries, as the United States or the UK or Britain or Canada, but we are a citizen of international communities, and we do have a moral and political responsibility to stand up if we have a problem with the Chinese involvement in Darfur genocide, in my view, and I do not make any I do not really apologize. I strongly believe that the Chinese government should be held responsible for what is taking place in Darfur anyway, because they're funding the genocide. So it seems to me we as a citizen of the international community, we do have a moral and political responsibility to stand up and then try to campaign to ask those who want to participate, and they do have the right to go and participate in China during the Olympics, but they have to understand their moral and political responsibility as well.
Thank you. Thank you. More questions, comments? I thought I saw more hands. I see a lot of hands non-raised. Yes.
How many rebel groups are there in Darfur at the moment, and what exactly are their concerns?
Okay, if I can just respond I'll leave it to you. So so far they are what I guess our statistic is 8 major rebel groups in Darfur. All of them they share a political stand toward the government of Sudan. All of them they wanted to end the violence in Darfur. They want fair shares on the political systems. They want to share the natural resources with everybody who live in the country there. And also they wanted a fair representation for their own peoples in the national government. So above that, they want democratic participation.
Yes. All right. Just hold on. Anybody else who hasn't had a chance to ask yet? Okay, you're not.
I would just ask you, what role does development have in this situation? First, how would you define development for Sudan, and then where does that fit into the whole situation? Is this post-conflict? Is this something that should be started now? And what kind of organizations do you think should be helping out with that, given the dubious history of places like the World Bank and IMF with their development schemes?
Yeah, I just want to say a few things on that. I grew up in Ethiopia and Sudan. We're neighbors, and the Horn of Africa, that region and stuff. My view is this: Sudan. There is a crisis in the Sudan, and state-society relations. There was conflict between the central government in Khartoum and South Sudan for a long time. And just recently there was the Khartoum government and South Sudan, the Sudanese Liberation Army, signed an agreement. And the agreement is an experiment for the southern Sudan to stay within Sudan up to, I don't know, 5 years or 6 years. 6 years, if things don't work out, for South Sudan to go its way. Okay, so that is north-south. The central government is in the north, Khartoum, south, around Juba, the capital in Equatorial province. That is the arrangement, the Machaco protocols. There is another crisis in Darfur now. Okay, and the two are linked in some ways, okay, which I'm not going to go into. So we cannot even begin to talk about the issue of development in Sudan unless and until there is the reordering of state-society relations, where peace is established, where citizenship rights are respected, everybody is equal more or less, the right of citizens, constitutionally, and then some sort of mechanism to share the wealth of the nation, the oil resources of Sudan is established. Then we can talk about, then we can map out, some plan for development. Amir, you want to answer this?
I think I agree with you. I agree with you. We cannot talk about developments in a conflict situation. So the logical things that we can think about it is to talk about developments when you resolve the conflicts. And the conflict cannot be resolved militarily. You have to resolve it politically as well. So that's why we enter the post-conflict situation. So then the next stage, you think about developments. And also one of the things that you mentioned, and it seems to me very interesting, the question of citizenships, because citizenships also there has to be associated with the question of development as well. So you cannot really engage in any kind of sustainable development unless you address the question of equal rights, is the right of citizenships, and also allowing these people who have different histories and different identities and different languages to participate effectively in the process of development. And that cannot be done in a conflict situation. You do it in a post-conflict.
I have another question. I'm a 22-year-old senior at William Patterson University, and my professor sent me here for extra credit. And I see that, there are real problems. People are dying, there's poverty, there's rape, there's violence. What can I do? Okay, I could sign a petition, maybe I could donate something. What else can I do as a student to help address a real life genocide?
That's what?
To the whole panel.
Okay, I guess one thing that you can do, you have to go back and try to read how the students participated in the civil rights movements in this country. So they played a significant role. I guess all of us, we know that, and they contributed enormously to the process of transformations of this country. And we could learn from that experience. And then we try to remember one thing. These things happen. Genocide happens because some of us fail to extend a sense of humanity to those who don't look like us. So as my advice to you, as I used to say to my students and places where I go and give a talk, and we have to remember we're not only citizens of our own respective countries, but also citizens of the international community. And we do have to take that sense of humanity seriously. And we try to extend a sense of humanity to all people who parts of this community, what I call it, the human community. So students, they strongly believe that they do have roles, and they are doing very well so far, especially in this country. They are very active on writings and campaignings and voicing their concern. And my advice to you, continue doing what you are doing now, and try to remember, we do belong to one community, the human community, and we are international community.
Thank you. Either one of you want to add anything to that?
I think it's a good opportunity to be here, and I think just over the years I've been here maybe for a while, and when I was a student just like you, when I came from Sudan I was very politically involved and politically savvy, and I was just watching the hearings that time about the Contra, and that day I never went to work and just glued to the TV and so on, thinking that the next day the government will fall. It never happened. But that is my background. And then things just went flat with regard to activism on issues. And what I just noticed is that, like with the Darfur issue, the way just like people now involved, like just this whole of this time being here, and things like all over the nation, I think like this is a new phenomenon. A new phenomenon, I think I could link it to some kind of assumption from people that people think that they have the power to make change, and they are just taking Darfur as a case in point. And over the country, I just see people maybe more into Darfur than me. Never seen maybe a Darfurian or so, but this is a kind of assumption. And I think the thing which I just want you to think about is that to think about continuity, and not this is just because of your student days. And that is just by asking yourself, what does Darfur mean to you? Because if Darfur could just come to the public arena, it's like, why just Bush talking about Darfur? Why like being in presidential debate? Why you think about Darfur? Why you care about Darfur? And I think that is a legitimate question to ask yourself. And to what extent you could just sustain that, what does that mean? Because if you think about Darfur as a case of these Africans being killed, so what will happen like if the next day the government of Sudan came to its senses and say, I am very sorry, Darfurian, I'm giving everything, go back, I'm giving you money, go to your homes, no Janjaweed. So do you think like mission accomplished, and then you will say, hallelujah, and just go to your studies, or think about your passionate relation with other conflicts and other people, you see? So I think like you have just to think deep about what you could just take from your involvement, like at this moment in history with Darfur, and to what extent you could just take this kind of activism and involvement, as my colleague said, as a global citizen in future even. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. Like, you know, the whole Holocaust, you said it never again. It happened again and again and again. Now, if we actually try to do something in this matter and is actually resolved, what's to stop it from again? And like, won't I get tired of doing it and doing it and doing it? And like, how can you actually stop it?
I have a sort of an answer.
All right.
Okay. Will a Darfur happen again in another country? Will a Darfur type of thing happen 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Yes. Because if in my short life, if there's one thing that I've learned, we humans are not saints. Okay? So whatever it shows its face, whatever stuff like that happens, we should link our arms together, our hands together, and resist it. That's basically the answer to that. Okay? Whatever evil shows its head, people of goodwill should get together and resist it. Fight for it, for social justice. That's basically my answer to that.
We want to thank a wonderful panel, and you've really given us a lot of food for thought, a lot of insights. We've learned a lot. We appreciate it. Thank you, and if you have other questions. And thank you very much for being here tonight.